is an author and commentator on Gulf politics, and he says, quote, "The GCC message to the Iranians is please de-escalate." Well, Ali Shihabi joins me now from London, and it's good to have you, sir. How concerned are you? I mean, you speak to people in Gulf states a lot. I mean, you have extremely good sources. How concerned are Gulf states about getting dragged into this Israeli-Iran conflict?
I think they're concerned to a certain extent. I mean, the Iranians have unofficially dropped hints in their media that if their oil facilities get attacked, that they reserve the right to attack Gulf oil facilities. That is unlikely, and particularly because that will push up the price of oil and their ally China will suffer from it. But it's not impossible. And so Gulf countries are concerned. They are trying to convince the Iranians to de-escalate, and they're trying also to convince the Americans to convince the Israelis not to escalate. So they're a bit stuck in the middle here. So it is an element of concern, obviously, because if things go out of control, the Gulf is stuck in the middle.
So we had ministers from Gulf Arab states in Doha this week at the same time that Iran's president was there. Saudi Arabia's foreign minister, for instance, reportedly said, and these are just reports. I mean, we haven't got this ourselves, but I mean, you and I should discuss this. Quote, "We aim to permanently close the chapter on our differences and focus on resolving issues, developing relations as two friendly and brotherly countries." Now, we know that it was just some 18 months ago that Saudi and Iran sort of completed this sort of rapprochement, as it were, mediated by China back in the time. It's never been quite clear what that rapprochement really looks like. But how important is it that you have ties these days between not just Qatar, for example, and Oman in the past, but the UAE and Saudi Arabia with Tehran? And what is the message from Gulf states, very specifically to Iran at this point?
No, look, a country like Saudi Arabia wants to have excellent relationships, excellent relations with Iran. The problem is that Iran talks sweetly but behaves differently. So Saudi Arabia approaches this with a certain amount of skepticism and looks at Iranian behavior, particularly in the way Iran behaves with the Houthi militants in Yemen, and not just on Iranian rhetoric or diplomatic language. Again, it all depends on how Iran behaves, because the desire to have good relations is there in the Gulf.
Just how convinced do you believe Gulf Arab states are that the US continues to have any influence over what Israel's next move might be?
Certainly the last 11 months have been a disappointment. I think the Gulf countries and Arab countries and Saudi Arabia have been disappointed with the limited influence that America has exerted over Israel. I think there's a feeling that America could have done much more. It can do much more. For some reason, it is unwilling to do so, even though it makes the appropriate noises. And that is a disappointment. Now we're in an election year. The Israelis play that game very well. And that makes the U.S. administration, particularly a lame duck one, yet with its vice president running, very, very sensitive to the political environment. So there is a deep disappointment, really, with American attitudes and behavior towards what has been happening for the last 11 months.
And we've just learned from the Emirates news agency that the UAE president and the US National Security Advisor have been discussing relations. We know the UAE president was in Washington. It feels like weeks ago now, but it was only a couple of weeks ago, of course, for the UNGA. He was in Washington, held a very visible meeting with the UAE, with the US president, Joe Biden. What do you believe the focus of the conversation would have been, very specifically between the UAE president and the US National Security Advisor?
Well, I think the message that all the GCC has been trying to send to America, which is that, to try to rein in the Israelis, because, with a lot of what their behavior and the war crimes that have been committed, it has created a lot of tension in the region, and it has allowed troublemakers to take advantage of that tension. And the American administration has been, very limited in its actual pressure on Israel, which should have involved holding back military material supplies to the Israelis, because that is a serious lever that America has. But America has chosen not to use that, and that's been a disappointment.
There are some quite clear options for Israelis at this point in their sort of counter-retaliation, as it were, counter-response to the Iranian ballistic missile attack of Tuesday last week. One of those options could be oil installations. And it is very clear from the supreme leader that he has warned Israel off from that option as an attack. How likely do you think it would be that Iran or its proxies around the region might attack Gulf states or their oil operations should the situation escalate?
Well, as I said, the Iranians are letting that hang out in the background as a threat. Again, it's unlikely because it will upset people like the Chinese, but it'll certainly damage the global economy and might impact U.S. elections, so they might be tempted. But at the same time, the Gulf countries and a country like Saudi Arabia will have to respond if its oil facilities are attacked. And I don't think that Saudi Arabia will stay quiet if Iran attacks its oil facility. So things could go out of control, but it's not likely.
Very briefly, the Reuters news agency reporting sourced material from, I think, 3 officials suggesting that GCC countries ensured Iran of their neutrality in this conflict. Is that something that sounds familiar to you, the term or the use of the term "we are neutral" or ensuring Iran of their neutrality? What does that mean to you?
Yeah. Yes, I think they want to make sure that the Iranians understand that they are not a party to what Israel will do. And that they will not allow Israel to fly through their airspace. So that's a question that the Iranians always raise. And I think the Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia are very clear that they will not allow Israel to fly through their airspace and will not be a party to an attack on Iran, whether by the U.S. or by Israel, really.
It's good to have you, Ali. Thank you very much indeed. Your insight and analysis, of course, extremely important as we continue to monitor what is going on around the region. Thank you, sir. Well, the diplomatic advice.